All right. So,
That, you got the lavalier mic there that you can clip.
so you guys really can't hear me in the back when I'm talking like this? Oh, yes, they can.
Larry's wanting you to wear it.
Okay.
There we are.
Oh, even more powerful. Okay, so Santiago. So Santiago. Thank you. So what attracted you to the story of Beowulf?
Well, first off, thank you, Son, for the introduction, and thank you to Francis Marion University and the PD Festival, everyone for bringing me here, and especially thank you to you, all the students who come here to hear me, and especially if you have read my books, that's the best I can ask for. So, Beowulf. Beowulf is not something that we actually, I'm from Spain, and I grew up in Spain. It's where I live most of my life, and it's not something that is really known or popular in Spain. It's not like, as I understand, Beowulf is something that you study in school here, at least. I don't know if you actually read it, because it's hard to read poem in some ways, but at least you studied like one of the sources of the English language and English literature. So, and we all have in our respective national cultures some heroic poem that is at the start of everything. We have one in Spain too, which is the one that we studied, but not Beowulf. Beowulf was something completely foreign to me, and I asked this question myself a lot of times, like, even what right did I have to write about something that didn't belong to my own tradition? Well, the thing is that I found Beowulf for the first time when I was a kid in my uncle's library. He had this book, which was called Myths and Legends. And I think the title is very self-defining. It was a book who retold a lot of the Greek myths, but also myths and legends from all cultures all over the world. You have everything from the Argonauts to, I don't know, Tristan and Isolde, and a lot of things. And one of them was Beowulf, which was, the book was illustrated. And I love the stories and I love the illustrations. I actually stole the book from my uncle. He doesn't know it. I was visiting his house almost every weekend, and while the grown-ups were talking, I slipped into the library and I finally took it with me without telling, and I still keep it. And so I was doing and thinking about comics since I was, I don't know, I don't remember myself without a comic in my hands. Like, it was something like my life forever since the start. And I started to think, how good would it be to have a comic of Beowulf when I was, I don't know, maybe 8, 10, because I hadn't seen a real Beowulf comic, but in a way, it kind of overlapped a lot with the kind of superhero comics that I used to read. I mean, it was a fantasy book about monsters and warriors and adventures and action and all those things. So I was thinking, like, this is a huge story that I would like to do as a comic one day. And when I started doing comics, that was one of my first 2 projects. I just directly went to that, because I think that you have always to, you get so many ideas, so many things that you note down in your notebook, and you think that I could do this, I could do the other thing, that this is brilliant. But in the end, you have to go with the things that have stayed with you for the longest time, like something that you have been able to mature for years and years till you are absolutely sure that you can commit to that stuff. That's what I felt. And then recently, it's funny because this was like my first project ever, and I've had it with me for my whole life. I never thought till recently a professor here in the US wrote an essay about this book. And in this essay, he was talking about how Beowulf was a book about immigrants. Like the way that it's like the English national poem, but it's not set in England, it's set in Scandinavia, and there's no Englishman at all in the whole story. And the story is about someone who comes from the outside and changes a country and everything. And then I was reading this after years of doing the work and thinking about it, and I was reading this as an immigrant here, like as someone who came from outside and started a new life here. My daughter is American and everything. I was thinking, wow, it's funny how you work on things and they come back to you after years and they mean really something that you would have never expected.
So, Joangela, would you like to read a poem to kick us off?
Sure. Again, thank you, everybody, for coming, and thanks to FMU for hosting this every year, particularly Dr. Carter. I don't know that he's here now, but we are very fortunate to get to do this every year. So those of you who this might be the first festival for, please remember us in future years and come back, particularly if you enjoy it. My apologies, I'm getting over a cold, so my voice isn't great. And it is a cold, not COVID. I've tested so many times. I'm going to read a poem called Eve. How many words contain her name? Even, as if she had an even chance. Prevent, as if her sin weren't preordained. Of course, as she was the mother of it all, dark and light, yes, even the serpent, her writhing child, the birth of her undoing. Who can blame her, not trusting the men, the father who commands without explanation, the mate who complains of the pain she left in his robbed breast? The prophet had him sounding thankful, proof the prophet thought himself a man. Any wonder she identified with a thing soon to be forced to crawl each day on its belly? But that's not right. She proved strong, as are all things built of bone. How else explain her choice to leave paradise, make no mistake, to bring a beautifully flawed world into being? Who else but this stiff-backed woman caught in the midst of both never and forever?
So, Joangela, that's a poem from A Dangerous Heaven.
Yes.
And so I'll ask you the same question that I asked Santiago. You know, what is it that drew you to this dangerous heaven, and you know, what inspired you?
Well, a friend of mine once told me years ago that I tend to write a lot of angry woman poems. And I don't write that exclusively, but I guess that's true. And one of the things that really, I remember when I was young, I remember being angry about very few things, but one thing I was angry about, I went to a Baptist school, and for a while I wanted to be a minister. And you can't be a minister, at least not in the 1980s. If you were a Baptist woman, you can't have a leadership role. And I just did not understand why God cared about our anatomy when he gave it to us, when I knew I was smarter than some of the people telling me I couldn't be a minister. But it's one of those things where I just often have experienced and witnessed and heard stories of women being told, you can't, when they very well can and often do, and no one pays attention to how well they do it. And I think that might be in high relief this week based on news events, but that was a big part of it. I was putting this collection together, and it's got a lot of different poems in it. There are poems in here about my family, there are poems in here about politics, there are poems in here about other people I loved, about grief, all sorts of things. But I thought, well, one of the things that is a struggle for women in particular, I think, is that we carry a lot of the world's emotion on our backs. Not just our own, but the world's. It's like we become the receptacle of other people's emotions. And I was thinking about the Bible and how those same people who said you can't be a minister would tell the stories of women in the Bible. And of course, Eve is a prime example. And very often the women either were pushed to the background or they were blamed for things that weren't really their fault. And so I wanted to tell their stories from a different perspective. So that became an organizing principle of the book.
And why approach that material through poetry? What is it that poetry does for that material?
Well, it's the only kind of writing I seem to be able to do a lot of times. I don't know why. I have written a little bit of flash fiction here and there, but I do think poetry has, this may connect with Santiago and his love of Beowulf, and even though it was foreign to his culture, it's not just that there are stories that are told, but that they're told in a kind of music, a kind of beautiful language that strips bare some of that emotion that all of us carry. And it certainly, I think, there's something about a poem that gives the power of a zinger to it that sometimes prose doesn't have. Not always. Prose can have zingers too, but particularly, I see that my retired colleague, Dr. Becky Flanagan, is in here. And she and I taught the poetry classes here for many years together, and she would always talk about poems having a nice landing. And I love that word for it. Where a poem puts you at the end is a place that should be a little bit different, if not a lot different, from where it starts. And so I think when you're trying to tell stories in such a way that you're asking people to look at them differently, then that structure to a poem is really useful for that.
So Santiago, I taught this book in the high school through dual enrollment, and I tried to get Spanish teachers and English teachers to teach the book, but their principals wouldn't let them do it because they were afraid that it would be banned. Yes. So the book does not avoid sexually explicit and extremely violent images and language.
Yeah.
And why are those violent and sexual images important to the story?
Well, I guess they are in the original. I think there's this this big trove of stories from our traditions, everything that is basically in the public domain, like you go back to the 19th century, and then suddenly, the Stevenson books are youth books or something, and they are not. And many other stories that go back in the way, they've been assimilated into the mainstream culture in a way that you feel that you have to teach them to kids. Even if you go to Homer, the Iliad or the Odyssey, they're not really children's books, but
right.
Nobody is taking them as grown-up books right now. They're in this kind of limbo. I think that Beowulf is kind of the same. People think that it's something that you have to go when you're a youngster, and then you have the base enough to go on to bigger or more mature literature. But if you go and actually read the book is full of blood and violence and guts, and it's terrible. It's just that it's only words, and words are not the same as images. When you get, Beowulf naked is fighting Grendel, and he just wrests the arm from Grendel, just like that. That's in the book. That's described in the book, and it's described in a very violent language. So unless you want to do some kind of sanitized version for little children, which was not what we were. This is another of the big misconceptions that we have a lot with comics. You do a comic about a graphic novel or a comic about anything, and you're just thinking of yourself or other adult readers, and immediately someone will come to you and will tell you, I love your comic, it's beautiful, it's so good, but I can show it to my children. And it's like, okay, would you go and say that to Stephen King? Or I don't know, like, you just assume that since it has like pictures, it's have to be a funny book. So that's the only reason. I mean, like, can you imagine like bloodless Beowulf? It's like,
So this is the last question, then I'll open it to the audience. I've got a lot of other questions. So what challenges did you face, Joangela, in writing A Dangerous Heaven?
One was time. Poetry's not like fiction, and I think Adam said this in the last panel, talking with Jamila, that we admire, I think a lot of us poets admire the tenacity of fiction writers and the intellect of fiction writers who have to think in terms of plot, and if this character does this, what's this character going to do in response, and how is that going to drive the next 60, 80 pages of a book? We don't have to do that typically, thank God. But there's still time involved in writing poetry. I mean, I might draft one in 30 or 45 minutes, but I'm going to type it up late. I always draft by hand. Almost always. And then I'm going to type it up later, which means that's going to be the first revision. And then I'm going to go back to it some weeks later and look at it and work on it again. And usually go back to another time and work on it again, perhaps right before I'm going to send it out somewhere. And that takes time. You can't, well, I mean, if you self-publish, you can, but it's hard sometimes to get a book published if you haven't published a lot of the poems in journals in advance, and that takes time, all right? You also have a day job, because there are very few poets who can get by with being, writing out poet on their tax forms, because, you don't get the money being a poet. So you've got to do those sorts of things. You've got a life, all these sorts of things. So time was one of the big challenges. The other was figuring out, because this is a first full-length collection, we live in a world where, at least in the poetry world, a lot of book publishers are looking for tight themes these days. And it's sometimes hard, at least for me, because I don't sit down and say, today I'm going to write a poem about angry women, and I'm going to do that for the next 15 times I sit down and write a poem. That's not how it works, at least not for me. So I have to figure out, where are the connections in some of these poems that seem very different, and how do I structure it so that those connections are obvious enough that a publisher might say, yeah, this is a cohesive body of poems that we can put in a book and put out there. And so that also takes time and thought. It's hard. To me, assembling a collection is the hardest thing that you'll do as a poet. So those were the biggest challenges, I think, along with also sometimes making sure that when you are asking readers to look at your poems and they give you feedback, that they will give you honest feedback and that they're actually reading the poems closely. Because sometimes they'll say, oh, this is wonderful. I'm like, I need more than that. So that could be and I get how it's hard to sometimes say, yeah, you need to change this part, but that's really what we need. So those are the biggest ones for me.
And so the same question for you, Santiago. When you were writing and working on Beowulf, what were some of the challenges that you faced in moving through the project and seeing it to completion?
oh my gosh, like the Beowulf project was so challenging. We actually have two Beowulf books. Like one that we started and worked on it for, I don't know, like I would say 10 years, and we didn't finish, and we abandoned. And then we started again with a new artist, which is David, who actually finished the book. And then for our 10th anniversary edition, we managed to get both of the books for the first time in one. So it was, I mean, making a comic, like a graphic novel, it's like more challenging, I think, than making a big, like Hollywood movie or something. They can involve like hundreds of people and spend millions of dollars, and they will have it done in 8 months, and we will be toiling for years and years. It's so hard because it's very time consuming. I mean, if you work by yourself, if you are the one who writes and draws and do the art just by yourself, you have to do everything. It's very tiring. You need a lot of time. If you work as a pair, as I usually do, like I write and the other guy does the art, I mean, like, it can take forever. Like you can draw a page a day. Like, if you're drawing like 200 pages or more, you need maybe 2 years to do that. And who's going to pay for 2 years of work? Like, so you have to do a lot of things at the same time because you have to live, you have to pay your bills, and you have to find the time and the energy somehow to afterwards do that. And if it goes well, yeah, it will pay back a little. It will pay back enough to fool you into trying again. like you will forget all those nights in which you swore that this was the last one. Suddenly, yeah, amnesia is something terrible, but it keeps us moving.
Great. So does the audience have questions? Right here.
Oh, I'm sorry. So this is for Santiago, about ladies in waiting. Growing up in America, I'm not as familiar with Velasquez as you would be growing up in Spain. So I was wondering if there's any cultural nuances or important things that you feel are lost in the English version that I maybe wouldn't have gotten that are very obvious to you and you'd like to explain.
Well, there are a lot. At the same time, it doesn't matter. Like, I mean, when I saw I saw the translation before it went to print, and I have so many notes. Like, it's really hard because it's not just. I mean, I am a translator also. I translate comics. I've been translating comics all my life. I translate Spider-Man and X-Men and all these things. And people think that translating is kind of like, I don't know, maths or something where you have an equation and you put some letters there, some words, and then it goes through, calculus, and it comes out the result. And translating is writing. It's like rewriting everything. I mean, I feel that words are not just words. They carry all that cultural context and meaning, and sometimes you just can't bring it with you because your audience has no way to know about that. And sometimes in novels or essays or something, you will have footnotes where they will try to explain a lot of things, but it's not that you can do that in comics, but I won't do it. I don't like that. It's like putting something, I mean, comics is more than just text. It's a design, a whole design. You can start to fill up the gutters with all that text. So yes, there were a lot. I mean, it was like even, I noticed that the person who was translating the book didn't actually understand what she was reading sometimes, like in terms of, what?
I've read both.
Yeah, yeah. So I have a lot of notes that it gets to a point that you start to think, maybe I should do this myself, but you can do that. I mean, I think that the translator has always to be someone whose mother tongue is the destination language, because I'm going to always miss things about what you really got or not. But at the same time, doesn't matter because it's not about that. It's not, I mean, the setting is historical, but it's not about history, exactly. I don't care about that. I don't care about those details. I want to think that we were telling something that was not just informative about that time in Spain. It could be happening anywhere, and we could have chosen any different characters and settings in other places and other times to tell kind of the same thing. So it's okay, as long as you get some sense of the whole reading, you get what you want, and that's fine for me. I mean, I'm not crazy about, I'm trying to relay these messages, and I need them to get clearly to the receptor. I'm fine with whatever you take from the book.
Next question, in the back.
Hi, thank you both for being here. My question is for both of you, and you both talked about things from past and things that have been with you for a while. Santiago, you said you have to go with the things that have stayed with you for the longest time. So I'm wondering for other writers or students who are looking for writing and how they're writing, how can you encourage them to take the things that have been with them for the longest and turn it into something through writing graphic novels or poetry or fiction, and taking something that's not just journal writing, but kind of crafting it into something to put out into the world?
Stole my mind. No problem. That's an excellent question. It's one of those things that if you could bottle it, you'd probably be rich. Because I do think it varies somewhat from person to person. The thing that I think, particularly in teaching poetry, that a lot of students have to get their mind around is that you're writing for an audience, right? The poet Mark Doty was interviewed on a Bill Moyer special about poetry many years ago. And he made the comment that people say, I write for myself, and there's an extent to which that's true. And I would agree with him on that. And I also think that you can't get too absorbed with your audience, because then you're not speaking from an authentic space. So this is partly the tap dance you have to do. But he said, but if that were true, you'd just put it in a drawer, stick it away, and nobody would ever see it. At some point, usually we want to put it out there. So I think one of the things that you have to do when you've drafted a poem is put it away for a while, which is one of the reasons that I don't type my poems up as soon as I write them, unless it's something that I'm like, ooh, I think I caught lightning in a bottle there. Maybe I better go ahead and type that up and start tinkering with it. Because I need to look at it with the eye of someone who isn't in the heady moment of creation, which you are when you first write something, I think. Go back later, and then go back later again. And then if you have the time, go back later again. And get other people who hopefully will tell you something more than this is wonderful, to read it and give you some feedback when you can. Be aware that you're writing in a tradition. That's the other part of it. When people say, what's the best thing I could do to improve my writing, it's a cliche to say these days, but it's true. Read. And don't just read, particularly with poetry, I would say. Don't just read the classics, although those are wonderful. But read what people are writing today, because you are living today. The world you know is this world. You may love it, you may hate it, you probably feel somewhere in between about it. But it's the world you were born into. So see what conversations are happening today in what other writers are writing, so that when you start inserting your voice in there, people will recognize that you have something to say about the world you're living in, and using the language of that world too. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. I agree.
Oh, wait a minute.
Hi, my question is going to be for Dr. Edwins. So you've been told that you write a lot of angry woman poetry, and you even said that you feel that the emotions of the world are specifically burdened on women. And I think that's really interesting because I think women are also constantly vilified for expressing their emotions, and above all, anger. There's kind of a consensus right now, I think, socially about like an interesting take on feminine rage that's come out. And I personally, as a woman in America right now, am very angry. How do you take the emotions that you feel, especially like you said, when you're in the heady space of creation? How do you acknowledge them? How do you bring them in? And also, how do you keep acknowledging them whenever you refine your work? How do you express these emotions that we're constantly vilified for expressing and still carry them clearly through a piece of work or a collection like you have now?
Thank you. It's the musical microphone. I find that understated sarcasm is a wonderful tool. And it is. I mean, I think sometimes we express anger best by pointing out the laughable folly of those who are trying to argue in repressive ways and oppressive ways against us. That's a deep, complicated question that you just asked, Leilani. But I think one of the other things, I'm a very angry woman right now too. I've been at least mildly angry since I was probably in about 4th or 5th grade at that Baptist school. But I am extraordinarily angry this week. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is, to some degree, not let the expectations of the world keep censoring us, including censoring our emotions. And pointing out, don't be afraid to point out not just the injustices, but the hypocrisies. Hypocrisy drives me nuts. That's one of the reasons that the Baptists drive me nuts. So that when you see someone, for instance, in politics saying, oh, she's not serious enough to be president because look at her crazy laugh. And then on the other side, a speaker who's introducing the other candidate has a downright maniacal laugh and nobody says anything about that because he's a man. You don't get it both ways. I'm sorry. There's nothing about the fact that I don't have a penis that dictates the way I should laugh or when I should laugh, right? And I would say the reverse. There's nothing about the fact that you have a penis that dictates the way you should laugh or how you should laugh or however you should do anything. We give so much space in this culture to the physical differences between us, symbolizing imagined differences between us. And if we could get past those essential notions of, oh, you're not like me, therefore you must not be good, how beautiful could this world be? I mean, it's already got a lot of beauty because enough people try to put that behind them to make some beauty. But goodness, what a waste of energy and space to tell somebody else that, well, you aren't like fill in the blank, that this man or person in authority told me you aren't like, therefore you can't do this. What? Watch me.
Another question? Oh, here we have one over here.
So kind of to bounce off of like what we had just talked about, what like impact do you think like your poems have? Like, and do poets as a whole have a dedication to society to be like some kind of voice for, I guess, activism or whatever it may be?
That's a good question. And I have all kinds of thoughts that I hope I can put together in a sensible answer. A very famous poet who was writing some, I don't know, 75 years or so ago used to say something along the lines of poetry doesn't make any real difference, and yet he kept writing poetry. And I don't think you would do that if you really believed it. Yeah, there aren't a lot of people out there who read poetry on the daily. There are probably a lot of people out there who are like, that stuff scares me. What's all that white space on that page, you know? And it is a different experience to read it. But I also find how interesting, and granted, I have a lot of friends who are book nerds like I am. But I find it interesting how often when something catastrophic happens, like after Hurricane Helene, for instance. I grew up right outside Augusta, Georgia. I don't know if you guys followed the news, but Augusta was pretty hard hit. And people there died. Fortunately, no one I knew. For me, fortunate for me. I've lived 11 years in Appalachia. And Appalachia, you know, western North Carolina and parts of eastern Tennessee were hit really hard. And what I found interesting was how many people I knew who weren't college professors. They had degrees in marketing if they did go to college, or degrees in sociology or whatever, and they're sharing poems to get through the pain of that. And those of us who were disappointed by the results of the recent presidential election, what I saw all over social media yesterday, the little I was on it, this poem, that poem, this poem, that poem, and poem after poem is like, take care of yourself, but get up and go on. Take care of yourself, but get up and go on. And what a wonderful message to remind ourselves of at any time. And I really do think poetry has a kind of incantatory quality to it. Beowulf, back to Beowulf. So many poems that tell the history of a people, they were written as poems because that culture didn't have a written language yet. They were imagined, I shouldn't say written, but imagined as poems because that culture didn't have a written language yet. How are they going to remember it? The music of the language, right? It might be rhyme in certain cultures, it might be alliteration, it might be any number of tools we have with language to remember things. Why does it make us remember to hear that? Well, obviously we notice patterns, but also to me it speaks in a deep way to the soul. That's why a lot of us, if we have a church background, again, I keep going back to that. What do I think of when I think of my days in the church that were happiest? When we sang the hymns, right? Because hymns are just another kind of poetry. Right? So I think that's really where we have the power. It's not necessarily that we can cause politicians out there to listen to us. Rarely will we. But we can cause people to think, to hear, to think, to feel. And then they might gradually start thinking, hey, this thing is really unjust. We should do something about it.
All right, I've got one more question for both of you. Could you identify an artist that has influenced your writing and how that artist has influenced your writing? A writer or a painter or
So many. I feel like it's not just one, but the one thing I keep thinking back about this question always is like that many times it's not the ones that we like to proclaim have influenced us, or the ones that we have consciously studied and learned from them because we really like them and we admire them and they're so great that we will feel inspired by them. Many times it's the lesser writers and artists who are, they are the ones who get under your skin sometimes, because you read them in a time in your life where what they did affected you, and in a way they planted a seed that later on grew on something that you thought about what they have written. What I mean is, sometimes I read a book or a comic or whatever, and it's so great, so amazing, so perfect that doesn't inspire me. Just owe me, because it's like, okay, I can't do anything with this, just admire it. Like, but sometimes I don't know, I'm watching a movie and it's like, okay, it's a good idea, but the movie takes a wrong turn, goes horribly, and then my mind starts to think, okay, this could have been gone that way, and by the end of the movie, I will have a whole complete new story in my head. So sometimes I think we get more inspiration from people who are not the ones that we like to say that we are looking to, than maybe the big names that we want to feel like we are associated with. Sometimes we just name influencers because we want to get close to to that people, and sometimes maybe some of their greatness will wrap on us because we're just saying that we're influenced by them. But I don't think that's what usually happens.
Yeah, I think that a lot of, that we really don't know what influences us as much as we might think we do sometimes, because sometimes it isn't something you read or a certain writer that you read. It's songs you hear on the radio, or it's, colors that you see in interesting combinations or whatever. Something sticks in your head about that, and then before you know it, you've written a chapbook about that or something like that. And it's kind of amazing. But in terms of poets, I wouldn't be a poet if it weren't for Edward Lear and Ogden Nash, who were poets that aren't often taught anymore and were basically play poets. They wrote silly little verse like, "The turtle sits twixt plated decks that practically conceal its sex. I think it clever of the turtle in such a fix to be so fertile." It's silly, it's funny, and it's playing with language. And I remember reading those things in an encyclopedia for children when I was a kid. And that was when I was like, I want to do that. And then as I got older, I was reading, I did my dissertation on Jane Kenyon and Raymond Carver, Tess Gallagher, Donald Hall. So obviously they got in my head. I love, love, love Lucille Clifton. And there's a poem of hers that I kind of recited parts of in my head every day during the pandemic. Love, love, love Ada Limon, who was here a few years ago, who wrote this wonderful poem comparing a woman's heart to a filly's heart, a female horse's heart, a racehorse's heart. Fabulous poem. And lots of other fabulous poems, but it's called How to Triumph Like a Girl if you ever want to look it up, but fabulous poem. Kay Ryan and Todd Boss do fun things with language that has influenced me. So all kinds of folks, but I'm sure there are people I would forget because I don't know when it's seeping in there in one way or another. I do know if I'm stuck and I need to jumpstart some writing, one guaranteed way to do it is to pick up a collection of poetry and start reading. It's very hard for me to finish reading a collection of poetry because after I've read 8 or 10 or 12 of them, I'm like, okay, now I need to go write. And then, before you know it, I'm busy with that and I forget about that collection. And then next time I pick up a different one. So.